Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and the timeline has settled itself. We are once again back to recording on the Thursday before the Sunday in which the message is given, and all is right with the world.
You know, I feel like when you open with a line like that, we should have changed our bumper music to some sort of Marvel thematic thing, you know, talking about multiple timelines. And that's just probably for me and you and three other people. Who
We can bring back your time travel sound effects from last time.
That would be interesting.
There's always some cookies for our loyal listeners. So we are, again, back in our timeline in this series. If you were with us as a church, last week we had a visiting pastor, Pastor Charles, from an organization that we partner with in Rwanda, that came and gave the message. We were not able to do a podcast with Pastor Charles, so we released the podcast episode for week 3 from when I was on vacation last Sunday. So again, we are back and all is right with the world. So this is week 4 of this series on the book of Ecclesiastes that Brian's been leading us through. How to live no matter what, how to live life under the sun with all of these challenging questions and issues that life forces us to confront, and coming to the inescapable conclusion, hopefully, but one that each of us must wrestle our way towards, that there really are only 2 ways to live. Live as if nothing matters, as if life truly is meaningless, and so just do whatever we want while we can, or truly learn to trust God.
Yeah.
And learn to trust God in the midst of the hevel that life is. Not that life is meaningless, but that life is just ultimately impossible to be fully grasped and understood on this side of eternity. But it doesn't change who God is, and it doesn't change who we are to God. And so we can live from that place and not just endure, not just survive, not just suffer through, but truly experience joy.
Yeah.
So with all of that said, Brian, this week, week 4, we're going to touch on one of those super fun topics that churches get to do from time to time.
Yeah.
Through this lens of there are some things in life that ultimately are meaningless and cannot give us what we seek.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about this Sunday?
So, you know, one of the things that we've said already, and for some reason, if you're just jumping into this podcast and you haven't heard any of the Sundays in here, is first understanding what the term meaningless means in Ecclesiastes. It's a Hebrew word called hevel, which is probably better understood for us, unable to be grasped, a vapor or smoke. And some of you have asked me this question, actually. Well, why doesn't my Bible interpret it that way? Probably for brevity and because in the original. But there is a translation out there that's a bit of a commentary at the same time called the Amplified Bible. If you've never read from the Amplified Bible, it is a great supplement to your study. It does a masterful job, actually, in these sections about meaningless, helping us understand deeper into it. And one of the things that we've been saying over and over again is that Solomon in this is he is confronting a whole bunch of themes throughout this book that are told to us like, hey, this can give us life apart from God. Live like option 1 here and everything will be okay. And he concludes every single one of these other than option 2, following God, is meaningless. Before he concludes that, though, he takes us on a journey. And so last time in this book, it wasn't last week, again, Pastor Charles was preaching here at CFC, but the last time we talked about Ecclesiastes, we talked about confronting pleasure. And one of the things is that pleasure is not an either or, it's a both and. There's wrong types of pleasures distorted, and there are good types of pleasures. And in the same way, what we're going to talk about today, there's a right way and a wrong way. It's not either or, it's both and. But what I find really interesting is what Solomon does is one of his themes here is confront one of the more concrete things that we can pursue in life that we believe can give us what only God can give us pleasure. It's kind of a sub-point under confronting pleasure. Yeah. But I drew it out, and in fact, of the text of Ecclesiastes to address the same way sort of Solomon did, because it says in Ecclesiastes there's nothing new under the sun. And so what I find super interesting is what he's going to talk about in confronting was true thousands of years ago, and it is true right now today. And he talks about confronting our belief around money and finances, what we think it can do for us. Now, I just want to say this. One of the problems, the Big C church, when I say Big C church, I mean not necessarily CFC, but churches in general, but we're not immune to it at Christian Fellowship Church, is that many times when we talk about finances, there's a very small piece that we talk about, and it talks about stewardship and giving back to God. There's nothing to be ashamed about that. But lots of times what happens is because it is really a subject that everyone talks about but doesn't want to talk about, if that makes sense. Like if you're right now in the United States of America and you're not talking about inflation at some point as an adult, I'm surprised. You're talking about finances. You're talking about money. You're talking about these things that are affecting our belief about our lives and how we live. That has been the case for thousands of years, whether we use the term inflation or whatever it might be. And so what Solomon is doing for us, which, by the way, is unbelievably helpful, is as the richest man in the world at the time, he is saying, I have all the money in the world, and it doesn't do what only God can do. And one of the things I mentioned on Sunday, it actually isn't just Solomon. There are modern day examples all the time of people who are unbelievably affluent but don't have any sort of contentment or life into the full that Jesus offers. I was reminded of a quote that John D. Rockefeller was asked in the early 1900s. I did a little inflation calculator of what they said he was worth at the time and what he would be worth now. Approximately $32 billion. Okay. Yeah. So there are people who are a lot richer than that. But let's just say if you've got $32 billion in the bank, you are okay. And one interviewer asked him one time this, how much money is enough? And his answer was just a little bit more. And we're going to tackle that, our belief sometimes about just a little bit more, how much money is enough? Because if we live through option one, the answer is never enough. Never. That was my singing for the day.
Greatest showman.
Thank you. But if it's option two, it's amazing how we can find contentment and joy no matter where we find ourselves on the financial perspective. So that's it. He's confronting the fact that we believe we can get contentment from finances, and the answer is no, we can't. It's hevel. Yeah. It can't be grasped. And we talk about that on Sunday. We talk about it more now.
Yep. And so again, the goal of the Faith Forward platform, if you're just joining us, and we continue to be amazed and really touched by the number of people that tell us, I just started listening.
Yeah.
I found out somebody just this last week just started listening, which is just so cool. So to reiterate, the goal of the Faith Forward platform is to make everything we ever talk about on Sunday as practical as is humanly possible. And that's not to say that Sunday's not practical, but as we've often talked about, it's essential that we start with the what is it and where does it come from in Scripture and why is it important? And once we've done justice to those things, most people are ready to leave.
Yeah.
And some folks might be willing to now sit through another half hour of, okay, now that we've established what it is, why it's important, and where it comes from, now tell me how to do it. But most people want to go home at that point. So we're here to answer that second half question. And so this may be the very first place where we have to pause and get honest with ourselves and get honest with God about the extent to which we truly believe in our heart, in our internal places. Be honest about the extent to which I believe if I just had more, I could be happy. If I just had a little more, I would have contentment. Sit with that for a second and just see how much that resonates, and not for the purposes of condemnation, not for the purposes of shame, not for the purposes of judgment, but simply for the purposes of honesty between you and God. Does that feel like the truth? That God, you haven't given me enough yet for me to be content, for me to be happy, and if you just gave me a little more, then everything would be okay.
Yeah. And as you do that, and again, one of the things John often invites us to in this podcast, it's okay to pause, take some time. You don't have to listen to this from beginning to end, by it constantly running in your car or however you're listening right now to it. Maybe another question that you would ask to get there, because sometimes I feel like I ask myself that question, I'm not real clear, and I'm a very practical person for people who know me, maybe too practical, as some would say. But one of the things I was talking to John off podcast about is a very clear time in my life where I remember saying to myself, if I just make blank, and I filled in the blank, money, I will be fine. Now, again, that was 30-some years ago. But even if you took that number that I gave you, that I thought 30-some years ago, and adjusted it for inflation, there's no way, many times I think, I would be content with that. I would I just need a little bit more, And for a lot of us, I think we've had that. Sometimes oh, well, I've always had the same goal and I've not met that. Okay. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of you who are listening out there, what changed? Why would blank give you contentment and now it doesn't? What is behind that story? And what are you looking to do that only God can do, but you want money to do it?
Yeah.
And by the way, why we talk about money and finance, it's really concrete. Mm-hmm. It really, really is. I mean, a lot of people look for their spouse to do what only God can do. And spouses are unbelievably valuable and good, but they're not God. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of harder to measure a spouse influence on my joy than it is, zeros and ones. At least for me, who tends to be more concrete than abstract. Some of you are it's not hard for me at all. I probably need your help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so one of the things you said on Sunday is the people who have less money, and that is such a relative word.
Yeah.
The people who have less money.
By the way, I wrote it that way specifically.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't put a number there because
right.
most of us think we have less money,
especially
absolutely. In Loudoun County.
Side note, when I was teaching high school, I taught economics, amongst other things, in the social sciences, and I came across this fascinating statistic that I then had to share with my students, that they polled a large number of millionaires, but single-digit millionaire, a 1 millionaire or 2 millionaire, 1 million, 2 million millionaire, and asked them what economic class, what socioeconomic class they felt like they fell into. Mm-hmm. And with a 90% something response rate, the answer was middle class, mm-hmm. which was just a fascinating take for me, for my students, as we were thinking about resources and how we think about them macro and micro, and that we really do often think we have less.
Yeah.
And so you said those people who have less money, who feel like they have less money, often live in a way that money will solve their problems. And those that have money find it does not solve what they think. Mm-hmm. And that this is what Solomon is warning against, that we're looking in the wrong place to do the right thing. We're looking at the wrong thing to do what something inside of us knows needs to happen. And so, again, on Sunday, you pointed us to another section in Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, verse 11, where Solomon says, God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He's planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. And there's a few different things that you could talk about when Solomon mentions this reality that God has put eternity into man's heart.
Yeah.
But one of the things that others have noted that has then struck me is when God puts eternity in our heart, that's not just a suffer through and someday things get better. It's what we talked about in the previous week's episode on pleasure, that God wired you for Eden. Mm-hmm. Eden is your natural habitat. It's where you were meant to live. And the day is coming when God makes all things new and he dwells with mankind forever. And there's no more sorrow, no more pain. Mm-hmm. That it's the return to Eden. It's the return to Genesis.
Right.
That is part of the eternity that God has placed in man's heart. That is what you are wired for. That is what you are intended for. And so it's not surprising then when that thing in us starts to come out and look around and go, well, where is it? Mm-hmm. Where's Eden? Where's paradise? Where is what has been placed in me? Why don't I see it? And it reminds me, yet again, I promised you last week that we'd have another C.S. Lewis quote. Here it is. Last week we were talking about the point that Lewis made, that God doesn't find our desires to be too strong, but rather too weak. Mm-hmm. That we think we're being over demanding, and God's like, you have no idea what I'm willing to offer you.
Yeah.
But it's not, you're asking for 2 apples and I'm offering 10. This is one of those apples to oranges things. Like, you're asking for an apple and I'm offering you wagon loads of oranges. I don't know why it's wagons. Roll with it. But this week, the quote that we have from Lewis, he says, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And that's exactly the reality. You were made for Eden. You were made for eternity with God. We did the Aliens and Strangers series a while back, right? You are passing through. This is not your home. You were made for another place, and the things in you that consistently look around and go, I feel like there should be more, are exactly right. But the way that we go about trying to satisfy that feeling of there should be more on our own, out of our own understanding, out of our own effort, is where we often get ourselves into trouble. And so that's what we're going to look at today, specifically through this lens of how I try to get fulfillment and satisfaction of the eternity that's been placed in my heart through this very tangible object.
And so before we dive in there, I want to make a point that you probably as a listener already knows, but just in case we may not make it as clear as we need to be later on, I want to make it clear here, or maybe have a different thought. We are not talking about money as evil. We're not talking about money as good. Mm-hmm. It is neither. It is a way that God can, not always, provide and give us life and life to the full. But it is not God. When we go back to Eden, I know this is going to sound a little weird. They didn't have money.
Yeah.
Like, well, money wasn't invented yet, right? No, they had God who provided for them what they needed. In a new culture, new time, God often provides through money, but the challenge is to make sure that we don't misunderstand where the provision really comes from, the provider or the provision, right? And I'm using the language a little, cloudy here, but that's really what we're trying to get at, mm-hmm. Confronting that we think that money does for us only what God does for us, because we can look out all throughout the world right now. And I'm always convicted by this, that there are people on different ends of wherever you find yourself on the economic spectrum experiencing massive amount of contentment from Jesus. Mm-hmm. And there are also people on different ends of the spectrum of wherever you find yourself have realized I either need more money or it doesn't solve what I think, and are still trying to think that this is what it's about. So this is not about, I want to be real clear, this is not about money as a bad or good thing. It's just a thing. It's about the way that we see it, we perceive it, and confronting what we think it will do for us that only God can.
Yeah, Jesus was pretty clear when he said money is not the problem, it's the love of money.
Yeah.
And so this is a good news, bad news moment in the show. The good news is there is a way out if we found ourselves trapped in this place of believing with wholehearted conviction that if I just had a little more, or if God just gave me a little more, mm-hmm. things would be okay. It would show that he loves me. It would show that I am taken care of. I would have all that I need. The good news is there is a way out of that because all of us, I think, find at some point that really has been a trap. Mm-hmm. It cannot do for me what I wanted it to do. We could talk about people that win the lottery and discover it didn't actually give them the life they wanted. We could talk about professional athletes that make millions and discover it didn't give them the life they wanted. We could talk about, kings of business and industry that discover I made all of this money and it really did nothing for me to satisfy the internal things that I've discovered I need.
In some of those illustrations that you use, actually Solomon addresses ancient versions of those throughout Ecclesiastes. So again, that's not new either.
Not new. The good news is we don't have to run headlong into that wall per se. Sometimes we have to learn the lesson that way.
Right.
But God is kind and allows us to sometimes learn lessons without all of the pain of learning it the hard way. As the poet Robert Frost said, and I did not realize this is where this expression originated, but thank you, Google, for the answer. The good news is there's a way out. The bad news is the best way out is through.
Yeah.
This cannot be understood only intellectually. This cannot be understood solely as a concept and not lived out. And that's part of what I think Solomon is identifying here. And as you skip to the end of the Old Testament, this is also what the prophet Malachi is pointing out through God's revelation. And again, this is always a tricky thing to bring up in a church in particular, because he's going to talk about something that feels very specifically associated to the church. But I want to make a separate point with it. But here's what God says through the prophet Malachi. Chapter 3. God says, "Should people cheat God? Yet you have cheated me." And And the people ask, well, what do you mean? When did we ever cheat you? And God says, you've cheated me of the tithes and offerings due to me. You are under a curse, for your whole nation has been cheating me. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, so there will be enough food in my temple. If you do, says the Lord of heaven's armies, I will open the windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great you won't have enough room to take it in. Try it. Put me to the test. Your crops will be abundant, for I will guard them from insects and disease. Your grapes will not fall from the vine before they are ripe, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Then all nations will call you blessed, for your land will be such a delight, says the Lord. This is the only place that I've found in the scriptures. Google confirmed it. I don't know that I fully trust Google, but that helps me feel a little more confident. This is the only place in the Bible, to the best of my knowledge, where God says, test me, I want you to. Right? Jesus, when he's in the wilderness being tempted by the enemy, and Satan says, hey, why don't you do this? Command jump off from a high place, command the angels to catch you. And Jesus says, don't, like the scriptures say, don't put the Lord your God to the test. The Bible's pretty clear in most places, you're not supposed to test God.
Yes.
This is the one place where God himself says, I want you to test me because this has to be experienced.
Yeah. There's several things, some on point, some not on point in my head right now after listening to you. Do you want the on point or the off point?
I want
one?
the whole thing.
All right, we'll start with the off point. It's a little lightning of the moment. I realize just about in every podcast we do, we have a good news, bad news moment.
We do.
Maybe it should be its own sub-segment. Like we can get some music. Like you can go good news, bad news. It goes dun dun dun. I don't
like
know.
how you're in the business of sound effects.
I
lately.
am in the business of sound effects. We actually could use the sound effects that we have right here on the board if we ever wanted to. Maybe
if
we
I
should.
knew what they did,
Yeah,
we might
there
start.
you go. But on the more serious note, there is a theme throughout Scripture of God as our provider.
Yep.
We are talking about finances, but one of the backgrounds of the Old Testament, the Jewish people as well, was not just finances. They weren't given to God, and so they weren't blessing. They weren't keeping Sabbath either.
Yep.
And we misunderstand Sabbath as like, something that is, let's go be lazy. No, Sabbath in many ways is time to focus on God and recognize that he can do for us in 6 days what the world thinks needs to do in 7. They didn't follow it in the Old Testament. We don't follow it lots of times in the New Testament age simply because we believe provision comes from some other place.
Yeah.
Right? Now, he didn't say test me on the Sabbath. He just said do it. Because this was going to happen. But really practically, right, he can say test me on this. And the point of this, and this is the part where my heart, and I just want to pause, I am aware, I think really aware, but definitely aware for sure, that there are people who are part of Christian Fellowship Church. There are people who are listening right here in this podcast that suffer from hurt from a church misusing Scripture. And this is probably one of the ones where I feel like that is often misused. And when I preach about it, John, you've heard me talk about this before, I say, listen, I realize when this comes out of my mouth, it could seem self-serving.
Yeah.
Because of the kindness of God through God's people. I serve God's people and I get a paycheck. So I could say, give to God, and it could seem like giving to me. Here's the thing. You're not my provider.
Yep.
God is. And so even if all of a sudden people didn't give anything and something else changed, do I really believe that God is still my provider?
Yeah.
How do I do that? And for all of us in the same way, how are we willing? And that's why he says test, because the only way out is through. You cannot experience the reality of what God is saying here without actually trying the reality of what God is saying here. One of the things I end on in our time together on Sunday was this question around, where have you been afraid to keep God's commandments in your life because of finances? Because when he ends Ecclesiastes in chapter 12, he says, this is the sum of it all. Fear God, be in reverence of him, but don't miss his fact, keep his commandments.
Yeah.
So he's inviting us, instead of the fear that we have and honoring towards something that's given by God, finances, instead honor and have that fear towards God and do what he says and trust him as a good father who loves us. And so we're going to get practical, right? Not that we haven't been practical or not, because all of us bring into our story some predispositions and sometimes we don't even know yet it's painting the canvas of our story in advance, but we bring it. And God wants to bring out what about our story that we're bringing into his story that's not true, and what about our story that we're bringing a story that is true so that we can live the life and life to full that he wants. So I guess we're ready for that part, right?
Yeah, I think it's time to go there now.
Yeah.
So, as is often the case, usually takes us about 25 minutes to get to the super practical stuff. But again, if you've not yet, I think the first practical thing we can do is, again, invite you to sit and pause in the space of, have I come to a place of agreement with myself that I can only have contentment if I have, and fill in the blank with a dollar figure? Because I think many of us have, and maybe that was childhood ambition. Maybe that was the teenager making minimum wage at the gas station, like me, that thought, man, if I could ever be making like, I don't know, 35 grand a year, I would just be living large.
Yeah.
And then I started my first adult job making 35 grand a year and went, what is this?
Yeah.
Where is the promised land that I believe this would take me to? And so as we get older and our lives expand to fill the budget that we find ourselves with, has there been a deep-seated agreement with yourself that has taken place that said, if I just had this number, either monthly or in reserve or whatever in my retirement account, then I could trust God? And those might not have been the words that you would say to yourself, but that's really what's in back of this sense of, if I had this, I could have contentment. What's in back of that is, if I had this, then I wouldn't have to worry. If I had this, then I could have peace of mind.
Yeah.
If I have this, then I could trust God. We have to allow those places of agreement to surface, and then we have to be willing to have a conversation with the God of the universe, who is our provider and who does love us, and come to face some conclusions about what we believe. Because for some of us, that feeling is built around a belief about God, that God is the one who takes away my stuff. And so I have to be constantly working to accumulate it faster than he can take it away, because that's who he is.
You know, one of the connections to what we talked about before that I just made while you were talking with this is, as I talked about 2 weeks ago, but the last week in this series, that culture views the church as killjoys. And there's actually a lot of us that, in the same way, while are believers, that still carry this idea that God is there to not make me happy. Right? To like that the Christian life is meant to be discipline. And so by discipline, we always mean drudgery. Discipline doesn't need at all to mean drudgery, but that's usually how we think about it. You know, when we call someone a disciplinarian, do we ever think of them as like, oh, the most joyful people? Probably not, right? Well, what I'm trying to say is, even inside of the church, with Jesus Christ in our heart, we can wrongly begin to have a view of how God desires it. So if we view finances through the lens that God is here to take away my stuff, somehow or another we connect that God is the ultimate killjoy. That our life is just to be suffered through. And we've got to unpack what it is about that is in our life experience that invites us to believe that lie is actually truth, because it's a lie. Yeah.
And so, and I love that you used this expression years ago, because I've held on to it since. Both my wife and I have. We use it frequently. Getting Bible bombed.
Yeah.
And I just picture B-17s. Just anyway.
Yeah. Just for the record, in my experience, the bombs were always in the King James Version.
Yes.
In case you wanted to know what type of bomb that they were.
Yeah, thous and these hit harder. But this is often a place where people would go and point to the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians, sitting in prison, saying this, what feels like profoundly unattainable truth, that I've learned how to be content with whatever I have. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or with little. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. And I really wish, personal pet peeve / soapbox, that people would never use Philippians 13 without Philippians 11 and 12.
That is true.
Because what I love that Paul points out here is, one, that he's learned. And this isn't classroom learning. He didn't memorize something for a test. What he's describing here is the experiential reality of his life over years, that I have had years of plenty.
Can I pause you there?
Please.
You may be going there already. You can talk about process for a moment. I don't want to have it.
But yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You just remind me of how burdened so many people feel about where they aren't. Mm-hmm. And I would like to suggest, if you're on the journey with God, to invite you to consider where you were versus where you are. He learned, we think of, like in the Old Testament, how many times do you hear it talk about Abraham sacrificing Isaac in that faith? He didn't get there in a vacuum. There's a whole lot of process before then. And so if you happen to be someone who is more susceptible, because we're all susceptible to shame, you could hear this verse and immediately go, oh, look at these horrible places I'm not, feel shame. And often what happened, John, when I got Bible bombed with that verse, it accidentally or intentionally was meant to shame me for not being where Paul is, instead of what Paul is inviting us into is this journey of what it means to go back to the verse that said, through Christ who gives me strength. Yeah. Where has he already given you strength, and where do you need to lean on him more to give you strength? So I didn't mean to hijack that.
No. That was all good.
You mentioned growing up Bible bomb that, and I was like, oh, flashback.
Yeah. Because you can't be where someone else is unless you've walked their journey or a similar journey. Right. And that's the point of this verse. I've learned. I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I've learned how to live on almost nothing. I've learned how to live with everything. By the way, both of those take learning, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. You have to learn to live with more than you're accustomed to, just as you have to learn to live with less than you think you need. But what he's describing there is a process. He's describing a process almost of initiation, that he's had to come to this place through experience, and that means it didn't always go smoothly. He didn't start out content with whatever I have. Otherwise, he would have said that. He would have said, from the beginning, I was always content with whatever I had, whether plenty or in lack, with a full stomach or empty. He didn't say that. He said, I've learned how to be content. That meant it wasn't always smooth. That meant he didn't always like it. That meant he didn't always believe that this was what God should be doing at the moment. I don't want to apply too much that Paul doesn't explicitly say, but I think I'm on pretty safe ground there, that this was a process of learning, and processes of learning usually do not happen exclusively with joy.
No.
So this is one of the first places that we have to examine. What have I come to believe? What have I come to assume is true about contentment and where I should be with it? Either I should have more in order to be content, or I should already be comfortable with whatever God gives me, because that's what Paul says. In either case, we have to come to God with those places of assumption and agreement and allow him to redefine and retune and reorient us to the reality of where we find ourselves now. You are not supposed to be further ahead than you already are. It's an impossibility. We'll come back to timelines again. You can't inhabit multiple places on your timeline. You are where you are. You cannot be further ahead than you are. And so allow God to come to you where you are and help you understand not only where you are, but where you are going, not where you're already supposed to be. We also then have to allow him into the space of our assumptions and agreements around what it means to have wealth, have money, have resources if we're following God.
Right.
Because this is another place where either well-intentioned or through the horrible misuse of Scripture, we have either come to our own conclusions or others have forced their conclusions on us about what a life with God should look like. The number of times that I've seen people take the one time in the Gospels where Jesus told someone, take everything you have and sell it, and then give all of that to the poor, and then come follow me as the broadest brush you could paint with of, if you're going to follow God, you have to take a vow of poverty.
And so I don't think we've said this yet, which is surprising this much time in here. The way to discern what he's asking you to do is by asking him. God, is this how this applies? Ask God. I'm reminded of a book that was really well-intentioned, a good book that was written many years ago by a pastor who's here in the local area called Radical. It made some phenomenally wonderful points. But here's what I discovered. Some people would take that book and how it called to live, especially around finances in some areas and that sort of stuff, and instead of asking God, should I do it this way, said everyone should do it this way. I don't think that was the intent of the author. I don't think into that. Oftentimes, authorial intent gets sort of hijacked. But what you then saw, and I know I talked to some people, it's like tension. Like there would be spouses like, oh, we need to sell everything and go to Africa. Did you ask God? Well, it says we need to be willing. Yes, there's a difference between we need to be willing and is this what he's asking us to do? Yeah. Right? And I think that's really some of the tension in a lot of these things that we have is that we separate what God is saying, especially when we look at that verse, sell everything. Well, are you selling everything? That actually wasn't what Jesus was getting at.
Yeah.
He was getting at the heart disposition and his unwillingness to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, he may have actually wanted him to sell everything. We're not sure, but that call revealed his heart. Yep. That's what he's trying to get at.
Yep. Yeah. And so as you look at the entirety of scriptures and you don't just cherry pick things, mm-hmm. you see the way that God interacts with resources. And the number of times that, just like that verse in Malachi where God says, test me and watch what I do. I'm going to bomb you, not with the Bible, but with abundance.
Yeah.
The number of times that God ridiculously provides for people in ways that seem fundamentally extravagant, potentially mm-hmm. extravagant to the point of wastefulness, of no one needs that much. We could take some of that and give it to the poor, right? The disciples' complaints about the oil that's poured out over Jesus' feet.
That is right. And by the way, that wasn't just Judas. Read the other Gospels. Yeah. It was the other disciples too. Yeah. One of the Gospels specifically points out Judas for the purpose of the story that it was telling to highlight. But it was the other ones too.
Yeah, he was not alone in that one.
Yeah.
Right. But we look at the abundance that God pours out over Abraham. We look at the abundance that God restores to Job, which if you've been joining us for this threefold approach to the book of Ecclesiastes, Sundays, the podcast, and Wednesday night, we talked about Job last night. And the recognition that Job's restoration comes well after the heart change, that this mm-hmm. is not transactional. You suffered, so I'll give you back. The goal is heart change and reconnection relationally, and God blesses.
And I want to give you a little heads up. We're going to talk next week about the fact that we can become people that unknowingly or knowingly hear what John just said and try to work the system. Mm-hmm. And we're not really going for relationship. We're going for the results of checking some boxes that we believe should guarantee blank at the end. Be very careful with that, because also what Solomon is going to say, heads up, it's hevel. That's mm-hmm. not how it works. Yep. And so some people could hear that and go, oh, well, I am going to do Malachi chapter 3, and this is what's going to happen.
Yep.
That is not what he's saying. It said he will bless you, but maybe not in the way that we think, and that sort of thing. So just be on guard for that. Even if you're hearing this, that's coming next week.
Yep. Yeah. And there's there is such a maturity around this topic that is required, because God gives incredible resources to David, even though David falls off the rails. God gives insane resources to Solomon, and Solomon falls off the rails even further mm-hmm. by the end of his life. God provides incredible resources for his newly born son, Jesus, as he's sent into exile. And then God provides profound resources for the people that come and support the ministry of Jesus. And so there again is another assumption. Well, resources okay as long as it's in the support of a ministry. Anything else is bad. Joseph of Arimathea is the man who purchases the tomb for Jesus.
Yep.
Jesus, apparently, to the best that we're able to know, never told him to sell all his stuff and give it away. And Joseph is the one that goes to Pilate and says, hey, I've purchased this tomb for myself, but I want to take Jesus' body and leave it there. And I saw a meme back around Easter that was something about Joseph goes to Pilate and says, hey, I want to take the body of Jesus and put it in this tomb. And Pilate says, Joseph, you're a phenomenally wealthy man. You've purchased this tomb for yourself and your family to hold, your remains for generations. And Joseph goes, that's right. It's like an Airbnb. This is just a 3-night stay.
That's some good words right there. I've never seen that meme.
But we have these assumptions around what it would or would not look like if I was following God and God were to bless me, that there is an amount he would and should, or there's an amount he wouldn't and shouldn't.
Which leads you to your question, John, that I think all of us at some point have asked, either externally or internally. We were just talking about this in a different sort of scenario pre-podcast. How much money, John, is too much? I loved your answer.
I'm going to throw it back to you first for your Proverbs 37 thing.
I was actually going to use that to launch into Proverbs chapter 30.
Fair enough,
so
and I'll go first.
How much money is too much?
So one of the most helpful things, because I am a recovering materialist as well, who has had all of my own conclusions about this is what I need and this is what I should have. And I'll be honest, I still fall into the trap now that this is my full-time job and this is how I collect my paycheck, that at my less sanctified moments that there frankly are some things that I deserve because this is now what I do with my life. And then God and I have to go talk about that. And I heard a pastor say at one point, and this has fundamentally helped to, I'm going to make this lengthy and awkward on purpose, has fundamentally helped to continue to reshape my understanding and experience in an ongoing way of how I should live my life with God with resources. Because I heard this pastor say, he posed a question, how much money is too much? And the answer was, whatever amount replaces trust in God. And it's interesting for me that some of my first assumptions landed in the place of, well, then that means there's a number. That means there is an almost universal number at which all people leading up to that point would have to have trust in God, and after that point, all people universally would lose trust in God. And one of the things that I've come to realize, both as I've listened to that particular pastor elaborate on this point, but also as I looked at my own life and the lives of others, that there are some people that have orders of magnitude more resources than I do, that are living a moment-to-moment life of trust with God, of God, I don't know if this is going to be enough to do what you've called me to do.
Yep.
And it's not a place of fear of, God, you haven't given me enough. I'm in scarcity, I'm in shortage, I'm in lack. It's, God, you've called me to something so big that even the quantitative amount of resources that I have, I'm afraid might not be sufficient to the task. That blew my mind the first time that I really had to wrestle with the reality of that a life of following God and a view of resources and wealth associated with a life of following God does not land on a hard and fast number for everyone, but it may land on a hard and fast number for me. If I feel like there's a place, there's an amount where if I had this, I would no longer have to trust God.
Which leads me to the Proverbs chapter 30. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 7 to 9 is actually a prayer that I've had for our church, and it's a prayer that I have in my own life. And the writer of the Proverbs prayer, and I'm going to summarize it, you can look it up on your own, it says something like this: God, don't bless me with so much abundance that I don't trust you. I'm tempted not to trust you. However, don't give me so little that I'm also tempted to defame your name or do something that I shouldn't do, right? He's really getting at that sort of balance. And for all of us, I was thinking just about this idea of, when we think about, well, how much is too much? Whatever replaces trust in God. And just this idea that you can ask God that.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean his answer is going to be, well, here's a number. That doesn't mean that's what it's going to be. But what he wants to do when we ask him questions is get at the real issue.
Yeah.
Get at the real issue. I think there's sometimes that God wants to bless us differently than he currently is, but he doesn't want to give us this blessing until we steward it well.
Yep.
Like we steward what we have well. I often wonder, there's, I think, a multiplicity of applications to the parable of the talents.
That's where I was going to go to.
Right?
Yeah.
And, there was 2 and there was 5 talents. And when I won't talk about the person who had 1 that didn't use it, we tend to almost consistently talk about that through the lens of money because that's what a talent was. But that is not a parable just about money. It's about what you've been entrusted with. And until he sees them use what they've been entrusted with well, he waits.
Yeah.
Number one, not because God doesn't know the outcome. He does, right? Some people are like, well, why did he wait? Didn't God know? Well, of course he knew. Actually, it's for us. It's for us to learn what we need to learn in the process.
Yep.
So that when he then comes along and says, all right, here's 2 more talents of whatever that might be of a blessing, or here's 5 more, or by the way, you buried it. Right. We got to go back. We got to go back to the drawing board that we learn.
Yeah. And the other thing that I love about that, to this place of whatever amount replaces trust in God, and the reality that perhaps as what God has given us increases, if it does, that's not an invitation to trust less. It's actually an invitation to trust more because of what he's inviting us to do with it. Yeah. You stick with that parable of the servants and the talents, and notice the order of magnitude and promotion that happens because of faithful stewardship.
Yeah.
Right? I gave you 5. I'm now putting you in charge of cities. I think we skipped some steps in the org chart here. Isn't there like a middle management position, like a senior VP that maybe I should go through before we just put me in charge of cities or kingdoms? But God significantly ramps up the resources that are available and the invitation to trust at a significantly amplified level the utilization of those resources. This wasn't an invitation into a life of luxury. Right? This was an invitation into a level of stewardship that dwarfs and eclipses the first level. And so it's an invitation into a significant increase in resources and a significant increase in trust. And that's the invitation for all of us. And again, so much in our 21st century environment and so much of our 21st century way of thinking about career progression and end of career planning and things like that is, I'm building up to rest. I'm building up to retire. I'm building up to be comfortable. And so much of what it seems like God invites people to, and we could probably talk about the theology of retirement another time, is I am continuing to expand what I'm entrusting you with and what I'm entrusting to you to do with what I'm trusting you with. And I think, for me at least, that fundamentally reframes the way that I think about contentment, the way that I think about how God must think about wealth, and the way that I think about how God seems to think about following him. And so it brings us to this place as we wrap up for today of what does life in the kingdom look like? Not just this life under the sun, but this life in the kingdom that Jesus comes out of the wilderness after his fasting and temptation talking about. Not just that I am going to restore you to connection with God, not just that I'm going to pay a penalty for you that you cannot pay yourself, that would otherwise leave you eternally separated from God, but I'm inviting you into life in the kingdom, life with your Father, life with me, life with the Spirit for all time, in what almost in some ways could be described as an economic environment, the economics of the kingdom, a kingdom that is at work doing something. And so Solomon says this at the end of the section of Ecclesiastes that you talked about here in chapter 5. Even so, I've noticed one thing at least that is good. It is good for people to eat, drink, and enjoy their work under the sun during the short life God has given them, and to accept their lot in life. And it is a good thing to receive wealth from God and the good health to enjoy it. To enjoy your work and accept your lot in life, this is indeed a gift from God. God keeps such people so busy enjoying life that they take no time to brood over the past. There is a life in the kingdom that starts now, which is what Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full, starting now. That brings great joy. And that is active and is intentional and has an effect. It has an impact. It goes back to the second week topic of leaving a legacy. It matters, even though we're all going to die and we're all going to be forgotten. It matters. Lay up treasure in heaven.
Yep.
There is a purpose for the things that we have been given, and that doesn't mean sacrifice and starve yourself because everything is for everyone else, but there is an invitation from the God of the universe who made you and who loves you and who wants to work with you, because the kingdom of heaven is a family business where all of God's sons and daughters work with him, that we are invited to experience the way he sees resources, that we are invited to experience the way he sees contentment, that we are invited to experience the way that he sees joy. And it's often not the way that we've assumed and agreed.
Yeah. And so, this is a journey for all of us. Where you are in this process, I don't know, but God does. And so we invite you to do this as always. Ask him. And anything we can play in this role, we'd love to. You can always email us, faithforward@cfcwire.org, or share what God's laid on our hearts. Ask you to then say, hey, how is that true in your life? But don't go anywhere. We're going to keep in this series confronting some things that, that we think give us life apart from God, but they don't.
Yeah. So until next time, he's Brian. I'm Jon. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you then.